Just a few days ago, something happened in Beijing that should have dominated every financial headline in North America. It should have been discussed on CNBC. It should have been dissected on Bloomberg. It should have triggered emergency debates among economists, investment banks, and policymakers. Instead, most people barely noticed. There was no dramatic press conference, no emergency summit, no breaking news banner flashing across television screens. There was only a regulatory announcement. And yet that announcement may prove more consequential than any tariff Donald Trump has threatened, any trade war Washington has launched, or any diplomatic confrontation between the world's two largest economies. Because what China did was not an attack. It was not retaliation. It was not even a warning. It was something potentially more dangerous. China began quietly disconnecting ordinary Chinese investors from Wall Street. Not through force, not through panic, but through policy. The China Securities Regulatory Commission, together with 7 other government agencies, ordered 3 major brokerage platforms to wind down their mainland Chinese operations. These platforms, Futu, Tiger Brokers, and Longbridge Securities, had become one of the primary channels through which Chinese retail investors gained access to American stocks. To many viewers, these names may sound insignificant, but collectively, they represented a bridge connecting tens of millions of Chinese investors to the American financial system. Through these apps, Chinese citizens bought shares of companies like Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Tesla, and countless other American corporations. For years, Chinese savings flowed quietly into Wall Street. For years, Chinese capital helped support American asset prices. For years, Washington benefited from the reality that the world, not just governments but ordinary citizens, wanted exposure to the American economy. Now that bridge is being dismantled, and Beijing is doing it with extraordinary precision, because the platforms are not being shut down overnight. Investors are not being forced to sell immediately. China has chosen a much smarter strategy. The platforms can no longer accept new buy orders, no new deposits, no new capital inflows, no expansion, only exits, only selling, only withdrawal. Think carefully about what that means. Imagine a giant reservoir that has been feeding water into a river for years. China has not blown up the dam. China has simply turned off the incoming flow. The water already there can continue moving, but nothing new enters the system. Eventually, the level begins to fall. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Until one day, everyone notices the river is no longer what it used to be. That is what Beijing is doing to one of the channels that fed capital into American markets. And this story becomes even more fascinating when you realize that it is not happening in isolation. Because at the very same time, China is reducing financial dependence on the United States, another country has been quietly preparing for a very different future. That country is Canada. To understand why this matters, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. For more than 70 years, the United States has occupied a position unlike any nation in modern history. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. International trade was conducted in dollars. Energy markets were dominated by dollars. Central banks accumulated dollars. Investors trusted dollars. Governments borrowed dollars. The entire architecture of globalization revolved around the American financial system. This created a powerful cycle. Foreign countries exported goods to America. They received dollars. Those dollars were then reinvested into U.S. Treasury bonds and American financial assets. The result was extraordinary. America could finance enormous deficits while maintaining global confidence. Its government could borrow at favorable rates. Its stock market attracted capital from every continent. Its currency became the foundation of global commerce. But every financial empire eventually faces a question. What happens when the rest of the world begins looking for alternatives? Not necessarily because it hates the system, not necessarily because it wants to destroy the system, but because it no longer wants to depend entirely upon it. That question is becoming increasingly important today. China has spent years developing alternatives: the cross-border interbank payment system, UN settlement agreements, currency swap lines, bilateral trade arrangements, regional financial partnerships. At first, many Western analysts dismissed these efforts. They argued that the dollar was too dominant, too entrenched, too trusted, and for many years they were right. But the issue was never whether China could replace the dollar overnight. The issue was whether China could gradually reduce the world's reliance on it. Those are very different objectives, and the latest brokerage crackdown suggests Beijing is accelerating that process. Because the money leaving Wall Street does not simply disappear. Capital always goes somewhere. Money seeks a destination. Money seeks opportunity. Money seeks return. And increasingly, Beijing wants that destination to be China itself. Imagine if even a small percentage of China's enormous household savings pool, estimated at roughly $50 trillion, were redirected toward domestic markets instead of foreign ones. The implications would be enormous. Chinese equities, Chinese bonds, Chinese infrastructure projects, Chinese technology sectors, Chinese innovation funds, Chinese strategic industries, all suddenly gain access to a larger share of domestic capital. Meanwhile, Wall Street loses a source of future demand. Again, not through confrontation, not through sanctions, simply through redirection. That is why this move deserves attention. Because capital flows often tell us more about the future than political speeches ever do. Now comes the part that should make Washington especially uncomfortable. Because while Beijing was quietly reshaping financial flows, Canada was quietly positioning itself for a changing world. Earlier this year, Prime Minister Mark Carney traveled to China. Most media coverage focused on trade, canola, seafood, agriculture, electric vehicles, tariffs. Those stories generated headlines, but hidden beneath the headlines was something far more important. A renewed yuan-Canadian dollar currency swap agreement. For many people, that sounds boring, technical, complicated, easy to ignore. But financial professionals understand exactly how significant these arrangements can become. Because currency swaps are not about today's trade. They are about tomorrow's infrastructure. They create direct financial channels between nations. They allow transactions to occur without first converting through US dollars. They provide liquidity during periods of market stress. They create flexibility, and flexibility is one of the most valuable assets a country can possess during times of global uncertainty. The agreement reportedly covers roughly 200 billion yuan, equivalent to approximately $28.5 billion US dollars. That is not symbolic. That is substantial. And perhaps more importantly, it signals intent. Canada is not abandoning the United States. Far from it. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner and closest economic ally. But Canada is clearly preparing for a more complex world. A world where economic power is becoming multipolar. A world where financial systems are diversifying. A world where resilience requires multiple options. And that brings us back to Mark Carney himself. Because Carney is not a typical politician. He spent decades inside the highest levels of global finance. He ran the Bank of Canada. He led the Bank of England. He worked in international capital markets. He understands how financial systems evolve. He understands how reserve currencies rise and fall. He understands how liquidity moves during periods of instability, which raises an important question. What does Carney see that others might be missing? Why renew a major financial arrangement with China at precisely the moment Beijing is reducing exposure to American markets? Why create new channels just as old channels are being restricted? Why position Canada between two of the world's largest economic powers? Perhaps because Ottawa understands that the next decade may look very different from the last 4 decades, and perhaps because the smartest countries are not choosing sides. They are building options. Many Americans still believe that threats to U.S. dominance come from military rivals, aircraft carriers, missiles, cyber warfare, geopolitical conflicts. Those threats certainly matter, but history suggests financial power often determines geopolitical power. And financial power depends on confidence. Confidence that investors will keep buying, confidence that governments will keep lending, confidence that markets will remain attractive, confidence that the dollar will remain indispensable. What happens if that confidence slowly erodes? Not collapses, just weakens. A little. Year after year, country after country, agreement after agreement. That is the question Washington now faces. China is reducing Treasury holdings. Foreign buyers are becoming less predictable. Interest rates remain elevated. Debt issuance continues growing. The United States must continuously attract capital, and attracting capital becomes harder when alternative systems begin emerging around the world. This does not mean America is doomed. Far from it. The United States remains the largest economy in the world. Its capital markets remain the deepest and most liquid on Earth. Its technology sector remains unmatched in many critical areas. Its military power remains enormous, but dominance and invincibility are not the same thing. The question is no longer whether America remains powerful. The question is whether it remains as dominant as before, and those are very different questions. Because history rarely changes in a single dramatic moment. History changes through thousands of small decisions. One country diversifies reserves, another signs a currency swap, another develops a payment system, another reduces treasury exposure, another redirects investment flows. Each move appears insignificant, until suddenly they aren't, until suddenly the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and that pattern may be emerging right now. The most remarkable aspect of this entire story is that there was no dramatic confrontation, no sanctions, no ultimatums, no crisis summit, no financial panic. China did not attack Wall Street. China simply reduced access to it. China did not declare war on the dollar. China simply continued building alternatives. China did not force Canada into a new financial relationship. Canada voluntarily renewed one, and that may be why this story matters so much. Because the greatest geopolitical shifts rarely begin with explosions. They begin with incentives, with infrastructure, with capital flows, with quiet decisions made in boardrooms and central banks. The world is watching tariffs. The world is watching political speeches. The world is watching elections. But beneath those headlines, a much deeper transformation may be unfolding. A transformation involving money itself. And if that transformation continues, historians may someday look back on these seemingly technical announcements and recognize them for what they really were. The early signs of a new financial era. One where China is no longer sending capital westward. One where Canada is preparing for a multipolar financial future. And one where America's greatest challenge is not an enemy firing a shot, but a world that slowly discovers it has other options.